So this is the help and review session office hours on Tuesday, April 13th. So the question is using aggregate demand, aggregate supply model to think about Keynesian and classical models of the business cycle. So I'm going to share the screen. And you should be seeing a white April 13th, 2021 on your screen, right? Just a white page, whiteboard. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. All right. So so let's do Keynesian and classical case. Right, so they're not exactly, they're not really different models, they're just different versions of the same model. All right, so price and quantity, price and real GDP for the aggregate economy. So the price levels like this consumer price index or GDP deflator or any other price index for the economy, the real GDP on the horizontal axis, right? So model is aggregate demand, short run aggregate supply, long run aggregate supply, and same over here. All right, so general equilibrium is where all the lines cross, right? Because that's where we're in equilibrium in all the underlying markets that are underlying these curves. Remember that. Hold on. And it's remember that here demand curve is comes from the IS and LM. All right, long run aggregate supply comes from the labor market. So this is just by way of review. Labor market and the production function. Okay. Underneath the LM is the asset market. Underneath IS, I and S is the goods market. All right, that's where these come from. So that's just review. I'd like to emphasize that to make clear that this is tied to all the stuff that we've been doing. It's not something separate from. All right, so in the Keynesian case, what do Keynesians believe in terms of where business, what causes business cycles according to Keynesians?
That supply side shocks.
Demand.
Well, we got 50-50 now. We could do a vote. We got two choices. All right.
And side shocks.
So demand side shocks. There's a easy way to remember that. I mean, I don't mean like memorizing. It's just easy. Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, Keynes, right? John Maynard Keynes is writing in the 1940s is when he's developing his economic theories, and he's developing those theories on the heels of the Great Depression worldwide. And the Great Depression was an issue about spending, right? Consumer spending and other kinds of spending never getting back. The economy not getting back to full employment on its own, right? Before that, right? Before the 1940s, before the 1930s, there was macroeconomics, but it was basically the classical model, basically. Adam Smith and so the father of economics in 1770s, right? And leading to the Wealth of Nations was his famous treatise, right? Talked about things at the global level, sort of macroeconomy level, but it was really political economy. It wasn't really about macroeconomics. It's really not until Keynes is writing in the 1940s in response to a decade-long period, roughly, where the unemployment rate was greater than 10%. Right, it got up to close to 25% during the Great Depression, and so his view is like the classical model where things get back to full employment, relatively quickly. That doesn't seem to be holding here. That doesn't seem to be right. So he's thinking about this, and so and what he's looking at is not supply side shocks, but he's looking at a lack of spending in the economy, and it's just not ever catching up, and prices aren't adjusting to bring us back to full employment, et cetera. Right. So if you keep that in mind when he is writing, right, that helps you to keep this straight, right? So he believes that the primary and Keynesian economists believe that shocks to aggregate demand, shocks to spending, right, are what cause business cycles. In other words, so here is potential GDP, right? Full employment level output, same exact thing over here, same exact place, right? It's a placeholder, right? It's a placeholder. It marks where full employment is. The action is with aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply in the short run, generally. Now, we'll get to that when we get to the classical model and modify that a bit, right? But so if changes in aggregate demand, an unexpected increase in aggregate demand, or more important, an unexpected decrease in aggregate demand, right? That's the one that Keynes is really talking about, is the decrease in aggregate demand, right? That would push the economy back to, again, price level P0. Let's start with P0 here. It would push the economy back to B, right? So what happens? Output, the actual level of output, right? Because this is demand for goods and services. Aggregate demand is what you learn in principles of macroeconomics. Econ 201, C plus I plus G plus net exports. Now, we're really just not worrying about net export. We're not going to open closed economy right now, but that wouldn't matter. We could include that here as well. But then we'd have to have an open economy version of the goods market, which we learned about in chapter 5. But so we're just going to keep it simple and have a closed economy. Right. So any change, any increase in C, right? And these are all related to the goods market, right? All of these things are. So spending is related to the opposite side of saving, right? Investment is what firms do. That is desired investment. Government spending affects national saving, right? So all of that's what aggregate demand is about spending. So if there's some decrease in spending in the economy, why might that happen? Maybe consumers get concerned about, they fear that a recession is coming, right? For example, if that's the case, then what's going to happen is aggregate demand is going to, they'll reduce spending, and actual GDP, demand for goods and services from firms, goes down, right? And how do firms respond to that? That's the key with this horizontal short run aggregate supply curve. They respond not by changing prices, by changing output. They cut back production. This is what you hear about in the news when the economy is slowing down all the time. Firms cut back production, they lay off workers, unemployment rate goes up, right? And we have a recession, right? So what the Keynesian insight, Keynes's insight was like, this is the Great Depression, right? We could get stuck below potential GDP, right? Aggregate output is below potential GDP. We call it GDP gap, right? The gap between potential GDP and actual GDP. And we could be stuck there for a long time, right? So classical economists would say, well, prices are going to adjust eventually because essentially there's a surplus of goods and services in the economy. More is being produced than is being supplied, right, in terms of potential GDP. So price level would tend to go down, and ultimately that short run aggregate supply curve would shift down, and we'd end up at C. But Keynesians sound like that would take a long time. And in the Great Depression, that wasn't happening. We were stuck at B, right? The economy was stuck at B. So if that's the case, right, this is going beyond your original question, Janine. If that's the case, how do you get back to full employment? What might be needed? What might be needed to get back to full employment in that case? That's a real question. So if we're stuck at B, prices are not flexible. They're not decreasing, which is what we called for in the classical case.
The
What needs to
federal
happen?
is going to have to pass a monetary policy so the IS curve shifts, putting everything back.
Or I'm going to come back to that. I'm going to come back to that. That wasn't completely right, but I'm going to make some corrections to that. But the general gist of that is the general concept is right, right? There are three things that could happen. Well, I mean, there are four things. I mean, sort of multiple choice, right? One is you could just stay there, do nothing, stay there, right? So, I mean, the short answer is do something, right? So the Federal Reserve could do something, right? That's what you were just saying. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. That's the LM curve, not the IS curve. Okay. Asset market, money supply, money demand. All right. So asset market is real money demand and real money supply. Federal Reserve controls money supply. Monetary policy has to do with LM. Okay. Easy way to remember that. LM, money, monetary policy. Easy way to kind of, you can, if you want to use that sort of simple way to remember that. But that's the reason. Okay. So the Federal Reserve could do something. So let's go with that one. What would they do? What would they do?
Adjust.
This is a really key point here that everyone really needs to understand this. Like, this is a basic point, right? So
decrease interest rates.
Decrease interest rates. Boom. The decrease interest rates. What's gonna happen? All right. That reduces the user cost of capital, right? We're gonna have more investment, right? That's what we learned back in the goods market, right? So the desired investment curve is going to increase. Lower interest rates, there'll probably be a higher, lower interest rates will end up, moving along. And what's going to happen? What's going to happen to spending? Lower interest rates going to do what to investment spending? It's going to increase investment spending, right? Because now it's cheaper to borrow for new capital. So for any given level of the expected future marginal productivity capital, now the user cost of capital is less, and they're going to want to buy more capital goods on average. Lower interest rates. Just think about this, right? Lower interest rates. What are you more or less likely to borrow money for a new car or a new house?
More likely.
More likely, right? So spending goes up, right? Spending is aggregate demand. So what happens? Pushes the aggregate demand the other direction, right? So Federal Reserve reduces interest rates. That's one thing. So the point is, we need to push the aggregate demand back to the right somehow, right? we can't really affect well, except for things like a change in infrastructure. We'll come back to that at the end. Policy has to do with aggregate demand. The policy doesn't really affect aggregate supply. That's not true. That's a too strong a statement. But in most, for the most part, the policymakers are focusing on aggregate demand. That's it. All right, ISRLM. So what's the other thing that could push this back to the right? What are the other policy tools? Macro policy tools.
Tax cut.
Okay, tax cuts, right? So this is monetary policy. I got fiscal policy. Those are the two things. That's it. Boom, boom. What's fiscal policy? Reduce taxes. All right. 4 years, 2018, end of 2018, beginning of 2019, huge tax cut. And you and I and everybody else are benefiting from that today yet. Whether it was needed, that's a different question, but we're all benefiting from that. Fewer taxes are taken out of our wages every week or every month or whenever we are working and get paid for something. Right? Our tax bills are lower, right, because of that. So what happens when people get more? They have more disposable income. What's going to happen? Consumption is going to increase. And if it's if it's a tax cut on for corporations, then investment might be affected as well, right? Because that's going to affect the user cost of capital in that case. Aggregate demand to the right. What's the other thing that can do with fiscal policy?
Government spending.
Government spending, right? Increase government spending. That's part of what's behind the infrastructure push bill. So it could be military spending, could be domestic spending, increase in government spending on final goods and services, right? New construction. If we go back a couple of years, increasing spending on building a wall, right, and on the border with the U.S. and Mexico, that creates jobs, that creates spending, right? So anything that increases that government spending on goods and services, right, that can push aggregate demand back to the right as well, right? So what's the big? So now let's come out of the weeds and think about the big idea here, right? What's the big idea? Big idea is that, right, in the Keynesian model, if there is some unexpected shock, right, something has to happen to shock the economy away from A. That's the point, right? So business cycles come from shocks, and then the response within the system, right, to those shocks. That's what causes. That's how we get ups and downs in the economy, right? That's what macroeconomics tells us. That's what the macroeconomic theory tells us. Classical Keynesian, right? That it doesn't matter. That's the way we think about macroeconomics and modeling macroeconomic behavior over the business cycle, right? So you read about macroeconomics in the newspaper and blogs and social media and television, etc., right? And an important part of this course, as I've said from the outset, is for you as a budding economist, as a growing economist, a novice economist, right, is to learn how to use economic theory, economic models to both explain, predict, evaluate what's happening in the real world. That's what economists do, right? That's what macroeconomists do. And so we can, it all comes together in chapters 8 and 9. After chapter 8 is actually having you understand, like, well, what is the business cycle behavior, right? Well, primarily the big takeaway from that is, like, most economic variables tend to move together. So if real GDP is going up, most everything else is going up with it, all right, employment and the price level, the variety and consumer spending, housing, automobile starts. That's why those things are reported every day in the Wall Street Journal. That's why I had you doing the discussion board postings, so you get some feel for that, right? And then we can ultimately link that to what we're learning in the theory, right? Because that's a really important, that's really important. That's what macroeconomics is about. And then also to think about, well, how does macroeconomic policy play into that? Monetary policy, what the Federal Reserve is doing, fiscal policy. We hear about that in the news all the time. How does that play into that? Right? And all of this is tightly connected. So Keynesian model, something happens to move the economy away from general equilibrium, and we might get stuck there because prices don't adjust. The other assumptions, prices don't adjust quickly to bring us back to full employment. And therefore, if we are concerned about this gap, why are we concerned about this gap? Because as that gap gets bigger, the unemployment rate is getting higher. All right, so the unemployment rate is going up. All right, fewer people are working. Unless they're leaving the labor force, which may happen too, but generally the unemployment rate's going up. That's what we see. The unemployment rate is counter-cyclical. Real GDP is going down, unemployment rate is going up. That's what it means to be counter-cyclical. Okay, that whole table in chapter 8. So to get back to full employment, if we care about, right, those are people that can't make house payments, maybe car payments, etc. You're losing human capital, skills are degrading. So we generally think of unemployment as a bad thing, right? And so maybe we want to do something if that's going to last for a long time. And what can we do to push aggregate demand back to the right? We can use monetary policy. We can use fiscal policy. During the coronavirus pandemic, we have been doing all of these things. Okay? The whole aim of that is to push aggregate demand back to the right. Why hasn't that led really quickly to a return back to full employment? And actually, it is returning pretty quickly. But why hasn't it returned? Because even with stimulus checks, which is really a change in taxes, it's a lump sum tax or to credit, it's a negative tax. Even with that, people can't necessarily, or for a while, couldn't go out and spend, right? So there's a lot of saving that is pent up, and as economy opens up, there's likely to be significant increase in spending. It's already happening, but there'll be more spending on going to movies, going to the restaurants, going to traveling, hotels, all sorts of things that have been largely shut down for the last year. Not completely shut down, but largely. All right, that's the Keynesian side. All right, there's more going on the Keynesian side. The classical side's a lot easier. So in that case, so first of all, what happens if there's a reduction in aggregate demand in the classical case? If there's a demand side shock, what's the assumption? All right. So there we're at B. What's going to happen next?
Only the LRAS curve or line could bring the economy back to full employment.
No, that's going to stay put. That's not generally that's not going to move. No, it might move. We're going to we'll get to that in a moment, that if there's a shock that causes that to move to begin with, but it's not going to move in response to being out of equilibrium. That's a key point, right? Long run average supply curve is not, it's a marker. So in the business cycle model, long run average supply curve is really a marker. It's a marker of full employment. And so everything, the question is, where are we relative to potential GDP or full employment? Right? That's the reason for that long run average supply curve being there. Now I'm going to come back to a separate case that from that, right, in just a moment. But generally, it's useful to start with that thought in mind, right? I can say the long average supply curve is not going to move in response to a shock in the economy generally, right? But what is going to move? What is going to change?
Does the short run aggregate supply curve, it moves down to where?
Right. And in general, why is that?
because in the classical model of prices adjust quickly.
Right, prices adjust quickly. So let's think about what does that mean? It means the short run aggregate supply curve adjusts quickly, right? Because that's what's marking the price level, right? That's what's marking the price level here. So in this case, we have a recession, right? So the vignette, the story, the video isn't different, right? At this point, but the point here is like, no, we're not going to be stuck here. If there's unemployment, right? Here's part of the story. If there's unemployment, workers will accept lower wages because it's better to get a lower wage than a zero wage to be unemployed, right? Wages and prices will adjust quickly, or there are goods and services building up on the shelves because there's not as much demand for goods and services. What are producers going to do? They'll reduce their prices to get rid of the surplus. That's the idea in the classical model, right? So it goes along kind of with the perfectly competitive model in microeconomics, all right? So if that's the case, then the price level will start to decrease, all right? And the short run aggregate supply curve will go down, all right? Like magic, all right? And we end up back here. And so essentially, okay, maybe we go out to B, we come back to C, but really we kind of go A to C. That happens pretty quickly. And so if that is the case, if we're not stuck out here at B, where actual level of real GDP is less than potential GDP, right? This unemployment that's building up because of that, right? So this is unemployment increasing, right? If we don't stuck out there, but we adjust quickly to there, then what's the prescription in terms of government or Federal Reserve policy or monetary or fiscal policy? Classical economists would say, no, back off, just leave things alone. The economy is going to get back to full employment on its own, right? So prior to the Great Depression, that was essentially the view. Did we have business cycles? Yes, absolutely. But then we got back to full employment, and so you had periodic crises that happened. Federal Reserve didn't come around wasn't in place until the early 1900s, 1913, right? And even then, it was more to provide liquidity to banks and that sort of thing, and avoid bank runs. They weren't taking an active role in the economy, and they really weren't doing that really until the 1960s and 70s. And so that's a relatively recent phenomena in terms of monetary policy. And fiscal policy wasn't viewed as something to move the economy around as much until we get to the 1940s. So with that lens in place, you can sort of rethink or think with that view in mind about FDR, and you can think about the Great Society, and you can think about all the government projects that happened in the 1940s, 1950s. It's when big dams were built, like Hoover Dam. It's when the interstate system was essentially built. Big infrastructure projects, the Civilian Conservation Corps, all these things those were all increases in government spending, right, to get the economy moving again. Fiscal policy, it came out of Keynes, right? So before that, the view was like, yeah, just we'll get back to full employment. We might have a little crisis here, but if in fact they would argue that if you pushed aggregate demand out, all right, that if the price started to go down and you were back here and then you pushed aggregate demand out, well, then you're going to end up out here, and then you're just going to end up with higher inflation. All right. And so better to just leave things alone. All right. And we know we're going to have to deal with business cycles periodically, right? But leave things alone. Now, I want to, come on. This drawing tablet is like a third screen, so I have like 3 screens of where the cursor is interesting sometimes. So I want to take this out. Oops. Well, I'll get back to that. Didn't mean to take out the lower supply curve. Well, all right. Get that back. Okay, so there we are back where we were. All right, here's point A. So in general, the classical would say, well, shifts in aggregate demand really just move us along that longer aggregate supply curve primarily. So if you're going to get changes in real GDP, you have to rely on, this is the one thing that's different, Kiana, that I'm going to go back on what I said before a little bit, that if there's an aggregate supply shock, positive or negative, well, then that can change output, actual and real GDP. And in that case, right, so let's say there's a negative supply shock, right? That reduces the productive capacity of the economy for a given amount of labor and capital. What could happen? What could cause that sort of thing? Well, if you have a war in a country, for example, where some of the productive capacity gets destroyed. Coronavirus, if you look at the solutions to the homework, right? There was a disruption in logistics and supply. Factories were shut down due to coronavirus during the lockdown in some cases, at least for some period of time. So same amount of worker, if you had the same amount of workers and capital employed, you're going to get less output and less output to the market, right? Shipping companies weren't shipping as much, and yeah, there are all sorts of logistical log jams that were occurring, right? Still are. There's reduction in chips for computer chips for automobiles, and maybe reading that in the Wall Street Journal. And so car companies have had to shut down production. And if you're in the market for a car, you're going to pay probably full price or something close to that because supplies of new cars are really low. Inventories on lots are really low because production is down. They can't get cars as many. They're really hard to get right now. It's useful to take macroeconomics. If you were thinking about a new car, I'd wait. Although the flip side of that is that there are a lot of people that have been waiting to buy a car because they haven't been driving as much because of the coronavirus over last year. So there's going to be an increase in demand even when supply starts to pick up again. So, going to be a little while. You're going to pay higher prices for cars for a while. So in this case, right, if there's some negative, this is what happened in the 1970s as well. Right, higher oil prices. There's actually a discussion about that in the chapter 9. There's one of the boxes, example boxes, talks about that. So higher oil prices tripled, quadrupled within a very short period of time, and that increases the cost of production because it's part of what's used in energy production, and the cost of electricity goes up, the cost of shipping goes up, all those things, and you get less output produced and less production. Anyway, negative supply shock. That's the point here. Back to purple. So what's going to happen? This short-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the left. Supply side shock. At that point, right, the long-run aggregate supply curve is here. We're not in equilibrium anymore. The short-run aggregate supply, long-run aggregate supply, aggregate demand are not intersecting at one point. What happens? The demand is still out here, right? Supply is there, right? That puts upward pressure on the price level, and we would see an increase in the prices, and we'd move to, let's call it C, right? In that case. So at the end of the day, you get lower output, you get higher prices, right? You get unemployment, right? Or less employment, right? The classical model has problems talking about unemployment because this is still equilibrium, right, in the labor market, but at a lower level of employment. So employment goes down, price level goes up, real GDP goes down. You're in a recession with inflation called stagflation. Bad, it's bad. That's what happened in the 1970s. For most of the 1970s in the United States. I was in junior high, I was in high school and in college at that time. It wasn't a good time, right? Good idea after undergrad to go to grad school rather than trying to go out and look for a job because there were fewer jobs, right? We were in recessions, 2 recessions during that period of time. So classical model, aggregate supply shocks are what cause changes in real GDP primarily. Changes in aggregate demand primarily cause changes in the price level, right? Keynesian model, right? Aggregate demand shocks cause changes in output, not a huge change in inflation or the price level. And they just didn't even think about supply side shocks, right? So the Keynesian model kind of has a problem with has a problem with supply side shocks. So in the following the 1970s, just like Keynes following the Great Depression, was rethinking the way macroeconomics work from the classical kind of view to now what came to be known as a Keynesian case, a Keynesian view with sticky prices, and prices not adjusting very quickly. In the 1970s, there was a shift back to think about, because the Keynesian model generally couldn't explain both high inflation and lower GDP, a recession with inflation. That just generally doesn't happen in the Keynesian model. And so there were new models. When I was in grad school, there were new models called new classical models that were being developed. University of Minnesota, Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, University of Minnesota, people who ultimately won Nobel Prize for this work. So again, why the classical model didn't go away, right? It's not like Keynes won the war and won the battle, but so work in macroeconomics today is trying to bring the classical and Keynesian models together. Ultimately, it's about how quickly do prices adjust. Now, that's a really long response, but I'm trying to capture kind of all the things, right, in terms of review around that. Not much room in the classical case, not really much room for monetary and fiscal policy. Just leave the economy be, prices will adjust, wages will adjust. We're going to make things worse by getting involved in the economy. That's the basic idea in the classical model. So you can see how, while these are not political models, they're economic models, they have to do with questions about price and wage flexibility. You can see how political parties might glom onto one or the other. All right. So you will see more Republicans that are going to be espousing classical kinds of views, right? Because that would go along with their political views about the limited intervention, limited role for government in the economy. Not no role, but limited role. And Keynesians, Democrats would be more in tune with a Keynesian model, which sees a greater role for government involvement in terms of fiscal policy, in terms of the kinds of things we're seeing in the Biden administration, in terms of what you saw in the run-up to the election, a Green New Deal, for example, free college tuition, et cetera. Those are all consistent with our model. They're all trying to increase human capital, increase the productive capacity of the economy. The infrastructure package that's in place, stimulus checks, and then the Federal Reserve is keeping interest rates low to try and keep aggregate demand pushed out close and trying to promote aggregate demand and spending in the economy. They watch that every week, every day, every month, and they're trying to see, okay, and are we getting close to full employment? If so, maybe we need to start raising interest rates. And so that's when the Federal Board of Governors and the Federal Reserve meet every 6 weeks or so, people are always looking for signals. What's the Federal Reserve going to do? And Jerome Powell, the head, has been indicating, like, no, we're going to keep interest rates low for the next year, probably close to zero for the next year. Why do they say that? Because they're using their econometric models like this to try and predict what's going to happen to aggregate demand, in particular, in the economy, spending, and how close. And one of the ways they do that is by looking at the unemployment rate, right? How low is the unemployment rate going? to give signals, are we close to full employment or not? Nobody really knows what full employment means, but generally around, think about it as around 4% roughly. All right, any other
Just for clarity,
questions?
I just want to make sure I'm on the right page here. So the intersection of the, or where the IS curve and the LM curve intersect determines where aggregate demand is placed in the Keynesian model, which also determines the output, correct?
So, yes,
And then,
yes is the answer to that.
okay,
And so, all right, so here's the view from the ISLM, right? What we just talked about, right? So if something happens to reduce consumer spending, the Federal Reserve raising interest rates could cause a recession too, by the way, right? Some people get worried about that, that the Federal Reserve gets too, not right now, but in the past, right? They get too, if they overreact, if they overshoot, right? In terms of raising interest rates, right? That would shift the LM curve back, right? And that would cause the intersection to be back here. Anything doing what having to do with government spending or consumer spending, right, is going to shift the IS curve, right? So the example we were just doing, it would be a shift in the IS curve. This is A, this is where we started, right? Just to run this through. So this is potential GDP, all right? And so to answer your, to really be explicit about your question, yes, that's B. That determines the level of real GDP. Yep, exactly.
and then in classical, it's where so the level of output is determined by the FE curve, which then is reflected by the LR AS curve.
Yes.
And are reflected by aggregate demand, where aggregate demand is placed and where the SRAS curve has to.
Yeah, but we can talk about it in terms of LM here, actually, too. But yeah,
Okay.
yes to what you're saying. Yes, that's
Okay.
right. Right.
And
so what would happen here? And according to classical, we can use this to think about the classical model, right? That as a classical case as well, right? The argument with Keynes, right? Or Keynesians would be, oh, this is where we're going to be. We're going to get stuck at B, right? Same story that we told up here, right? That B is the same B as I have in the ISLM down below. All right, we're going to be stuck there. All right, in a recession, and so if you are a Keynesian, you say, well, we got to do something to push the IS curve back to the right, or we got to do something to push the LM curve out to the right. All right, to get back to full employment. What do you do to push the LM curve out to the right? Lower interest rates. What do you do to push the IS curve out to the right? Lower taxes, increase government spending. Boom. But you end up either at A or down here at C. Now, in the classical model, the classical economists would say, well, prices adjust really quickly. And as prices adjust, the LM curve shifts. Because that's what happens in the asset market, right? So here's the asset market. Here's real money demand, money supply, or just MS, M over S, let's put it that way. All right. So here's real money demand. Here's real money supply. Price level, the original price level, P0. All right, let's say. So what happens? So what's going to happen here? The price level is going to go right at B. That's going to put downward pressure on the price level. As that happens, what happens? This is in the denominator over here, or the real money supply. This gets smaller, so the whole thing gets bigger. So the real money supply gets larger. So what happens? The real interest rate in the asset market goes down. Well, what does that? Well, let's call it R2, not to confuse it with the R1 over here. What does that mean? The LM curve shifts down and to the right. That's what it means. There's a lower equal. So for the given level of GDP, there's a lower real interest rate, right? So as the price level goes down, the LM curve shifts to the right. When do prices stop going down? We're back at potential GDP. All right, there's C. What the classical economists say is like, yeah, that happens really quickly. Like we don't stay at B and then go to C. I mean, Keynesians don't disagree that the price level will adjust over time. All right. There's a famous line from John Maynard Keynes, and so he says, because people would say like, well, in the long run, like, prices will adjust, and his famous line is, yeah, in the long run, we're all dead. That's his line, right? That's not what we care about. We care about the short run. That's when people are unemployed. That's when people are hurting. That's when, et cetera. And so, if we're going to be stuck at B, then we got to do something to try and get back, right? If you're a classical economist, you say, well, no, we don't need to do anything. Prices will adjust, and it will happen, not in the long run, but it will happen quickly, relatively quickly, and we'll be down to C, right? So that is A to C. Well, over here, when we had aggregate demand shifting back rather than aggregate supply, right? If we start from A again, all right, we ended up down here. That's the same as down here. They're the same exact thing. Everything has to be consistent. Can't be different, right? So yes, I think is the answer to your question overall, right? This makes it, with aggregate demand, aggregate supply, it hides, well, remember, is it, right? Do we use monetary policy? Do we use fiscal policy, right? So, right, do we use monetary policy or do we use fiscal policy? They're just all both embedded in aggregate demand. When we're down here, right, we can talk about it either in terms of fiscal policy, all right, that's shifting IS back to the right, right, or shifting LM, which is monetary policy. So at B, you can do something to push IS or LM, or you can wait for prices to adjust and LM will adjust.
Okay, so my last question to piggyback off of this. So in the homework, you gave us mostly, or it was pretty much all problems revolving the price being flexible.
Mhm.
So that would mean you're expecting us to adjust the price level, like, and kind of coincide with the classical model. Should you do the opposite and say the prices are not flexible and they're sticky, should we leave the Keynesian model?
No, in fact, on the homework, it asks, there's at least one, I think it's the coronavirus. It should be the coronavirus one, because that was a recessionary shock. That was a negative shock to the economy. So it actually asks, what if that wasn't what if prices didn't adjust quickly? Then what? Right? Well, that's the question we're just doing here. That's the B question, right? Essentially.
Mhm.
And then you got to do something. You got to reduce interest rates, or you got to increase government spending. You got to, so you have four choices: do nothing and be stuck in a recession. Wait for prices to adjust. Okay, that might take a long time. B, reduce interest rates, shift the LM curve to the right. C, reduce taxes, shift IS and aggregate demand to the right. D, reduce or increase government spending, right, and shift IS to the right.
In any of those scenarios, the answer is correct.
Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah, unless I'm asking, like, give me, tell me all of them. But yeah, I mean, yeah, generally the complete answer is like it could be any one of those three.
Oh, okay.
In reality, with the coronavirus, it's been all three. Well, mainly tax cut and interest rate reduction, but the infrastructure bill is aimed at the increasing government spending as well, which is what I mean, politically, which is what Republicans are railing against in the Senate and the House. Like, what? No, we don't want these big budget deficits. We don't want government spending going up. Even though in the 18 and 28 end of 2018, 2019, a huge tax cut, huge personal income tax cut, and somewhat corporate income tax cut. Republicans didn't really care about the increased budget deficit. In fact, they argued at the time, well, it's going to pay for itself with higher real GDP growth. And conceptually, that was possibly true, but wasn't true. And most economists forecast that, and the economic models forecast that budget deficit would increase. But that was a political. So what should get done economically isn't always what gets done politically. So, yep. So yeah, bottom line. I mean, so if you want a really big helicopter view, and I have to get to another meeting here in about 5 minutes or so, but if you want to have a really big helicopter view about all this, you should get to the point where in studying, in thinking about this, like, well, there aren't really that many questions you could ask in terms of this big picture. Like, things either shift aggregate demand or they shift long-run aggregate supply, and that's a question: how does the economy respond? And that depends whether you think prices are flexible or not. And even if you don't think they are, and you don't worry about the unemployment in a recession, well then, okay, you just wait. But and will the economy tend to move toward full employment over time? Maybe, but like Keynes saw, well, that might take a decade in the Great Recession or Great Depression, I'm sorry. So in that case, maybe you need active policy by the federal government, Congress and President, or by the Federal Reserve, or both. Right? So, and so what you've heard Jerome Powell saying when he testifies before Congress, for example, the Federal Reserve has done everything it can. Federal funds rate is at 0, right? I mean, they could actually push it negative, but generally they've done as much as they can do, right? And so what he says, when you read the news reports, or actually go and listen to the speech for the Senate Banking Committee or House Banking Committee, which they does twice a year, that look, the federal government needs to be involved in terms of spending or taxing, even though, yes, that involves bigger budget deficits, right? So the Biden administration's, that part of the challenge for them is with the infrastructure bill is which is a good thing economically. I mean, in our model, right? That's a good thing. Lots of good things happen from that sort of thing. That's why it's actually bipartisan. Donald Trump ran on that, so did Hillary Clinton, so everybody does. You know, it just didn't happen, but infrastructure spending. But you know, he wants to pay for that with higher tax rates. So that is a challenge politically, but yeah, economically, yeah. You know, then you have to think about negative effects of the higher income tax and how big they are, if there are any, and does it offset the positives from the infrastructure buildup? So that's an empirical question, and that's what economists are for. That's what the Congressional Budget Office does. They work through those kinds of scenarios to try and understand what the implications for the economy might be. So you should, like I said, you should get to the point where, like, oh well, okay, there's not as much here as I thought there was, or I mean there is, but like it's all ultimately it's either changes in aggregate demand or aggregate supply that cause business cycles. Prices are flexible or not. If they're not, then maybe we need to do something to get back to full employment. That's kind of the deal. Really, chapters 8 and 9 in a really small nutshell. But we got to know the details, right? Yeah. So I'm going to break off. Like I said, I've got to be at another meeting with all the deans across campus and chairs, so I can't be late for that one.
Thank you.
I will put the recording of this out as soon as I can, in between meetings, and I'll see you all tonight at 5. And good luck. Good luck.
Thank you.
All right. Bye. Eric, so Eric, we were just finishing up 9:30, 10:30 was the meeting today. I've got to be at a meeting with chairs and deans across campus in 1 minute. I am out, but I'll have the recording available as soon as I can today.
Okay.
All right.
All right.
I had an announcement, an email about that, last night,
Okay.
about the session today, 9:30 to 10:30 rather than 10 to 11.
All right.
I had this other meeting that I can't miss. All right.
All right.
All right. All right.
All right.
Sorry. All right.
Bye bye.